This is the Influencer Inc. podcast, where you're going to learn to build your personal brand and your career in business through social media, public speaking, writing, and PR. I'm your host, Josh Steinley. I'm here with Chris Brogan. He's the CEO of Owner Media Group, a highly sought-after professional speaker and the New York Times best-selling author of 9 books and counting. His latest is called Find Your Writing Voice. Chris has spoken for or consulted with big brands like Disney, Coke, Google, GM, Microsoft, Coldwell Banker, Titleist, Cisco, Sony, and many more. He's appeared on the Dr. Phil Show, interviewed Richard Branson for a cover story for Success Magazine, and once even presented to a princess. Tony Robbins had Chris on his Internet Money Masters series. He's constantly mentioned in all the big business publications, ranks at the top of all the social media indexes and rankings that are too many to mention. So let's just say Chris is kind of a big deal. Chris, welcome to the show.
I never know what to do after that, Josh. I feel like, yes, I am amazing, but I'm very glad to sit down and chat with you.
So glad to have you here. Now, normally we ask everybody a question first, which is, what does the word influencer mean to you? But I'm going to start this off with a different question.
Okay.
Who played Batman best? Who's your favorite Batman?
You know what? I have an answer. I'm going to guess you weren't expecting. I like the Lego Batman guy. What's his face? Oh my gosh, I can't think of his name. He's a comedian, and it's coming to me. He was also in Transformers. Will Arnett. Will Arnett.
Yep.
I like him the best. The reason is, so I was raised on, as a child, the Adam West Batman, then the Frank Miller Dark Knight Returns Batman. I love Christian Bale's portrayal and his like, I don't even know what you're saying, Batman. And what I like about the Will Arnett one is that it just kind of covers that whole gamut in that movie. The Lego Batman movie is kind of my favorite Batman movie.
Awesome. Great. So now on to that next question, which is, what does the word influencer mean to you? Because it means different things to different people.
You know, in some ways it means less and less to me, because I think that a lot of times when people chase the idea of how to be an influencer, they kind of go after the wrong pieces of the puzzle, which is why I'm glad you're doing this, because I think you've just got such a good sample of people there that people are bound to, through the amalgam of all of our opinions, come up with a much better way to do it. So my definition of an influencer, I guess, is someone who may or may not be able to drive someone's attention and awareness and possible purchase consideration towards a particular product or service of value to someone else.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about your business, what you've got going on. Who are you? What problem do you solve? Who do you do it for? I mean, you've got all these books, but what else do you do? People know you for a lot of books, for speaking, but what else are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny. I've been at this quite a while, so there's a lot of times that if you met me at a different time in my life, you'd be like, oh, the guy who started the PodCamp event, or, you know, he's the weird guy who wanted the free hug shirt. And, you know, there's just like all these various Chris Brogans. And some people say that guy that, you know, was really early on Twitter, which is the most depressing one. It makes me feel like a child actor. The answer is, I mean, I've always done the same thing really, which is, how do we improve buyer interactions in some way? How do we drive better human interaction through technology? So a company comes to me, the kinds of companies I consult with, the bigger guys especially, they're saying, you know, we have this big marketing agency. We have all this big stuff. We just feel like we're not quite touching that human element just right. We're not really getting people to go, oh, you know, in a way that we want. We can sort of numerically, we can throw enough money at something with marketing and advertising. And as long as we keep our foot on that gas pedal, we can keep it going. But we just want the love. You know, where's the love? And so the kind of companies that pay money to me are almost always the sort of number 2 or number 3 brand. Do you know what I mean? People always are like, oh, I'd love to market for Apple. Apple doesn't need any marketers. There's no one, you know, who doesn't quite know what Apple's selling. There's a whole bunch of people anxiously awaiting what they're selling. So I more often get to work with Microsoft, and I get to work with, you know, sort of the second or third person in line. So for instance, I would say that Amazon Echo is the leader in voice technology services for these smart speakers, they're so called. If someone were developing a new version of that, that's who I would consult with and work with, because I would try to think of, how can I make it even better? How can I improve it? The question I've answered a lot of different ways, Josh, over the last bunch of years really boils down to, in a world where they could buy from anyone, why should they buy from you? And huge companies and solo individuals trying to sell something all have that same challenge and problem. And I love the thought about tying this to your influencer story, is just that one of the questions is, well, how do influencers bring it? And I've been brought into, promote vehicles and technologies and food and all kinds of weird. Look, I was sent a whole bunch of raw coconut oil products. Like somehow someone would look at me and be like, now that guy knows about coconut oil, right? So I'm always interested in this. And by the way, I love the product, but I'm interested in this, because sometimes companies mistake confluence. They mistake huge numbers with that person's going to drive some action. And they also often overlook that small numbers sometimes have way better interaction if it's, a much nicer fit between a product or service. So I think it's a great question. I think it's a great topic because there's just so many ways to go after it.
So what's your own influencer journey? I mean, did you set out and say, hey, I'm going to write some books and I'm going to go do some speaking and that's going to really put me on the stage and bring me consulting gigs? Or how did you come into this role?
I'm trying to delete all kinds of snarky ways to answer that question because I feel also hipstery. I started way back. I mean, I was in on like bulletin boards and stuff like that in the 1980s. And, when I would be on a bulletin board service, this was like Twitter. If you had one phone line to dial in and leave your thought and then hang up and wait for the next guy to dial in, literally that's how it worked. And so you'd be like, that new movie's great. You'd hang up. No, that movie sucks. They'd hang up. You'd have to dial back. Oh, no, it doesn't suck. And it would take forever. So I started way back then. And what those platforms meant to me as a guy who was raised in Maine was that there used to be three conversations, which was Van Halen versus Led Zeppelin, Mustang versus Camaro, and would the Sox ever win a World Series? And that's it. That's all I was allowed to talk about, and weather. And that got boring really fast. And so when I first ever found these online platforms, I found I could talk to people about Star Wars versus Star Trek, who'd win versus Superman versus Hulk, the important questions, Josh. And so as I developed who I was, and as I, was off in my own Neverland or whatever, somewhere around 2005 or so, I started blogging in 1998 and I was like, this is cool, but I was so selfish. So like, it didn't matter. Like I was just blogging to write stuff because I thought it was cool. It took me 8 years to get my first 100 readers. And then around 2005, I started an event called, 2006, we did an event called Podcast. 2005, I start my first podcast. I think, whoa, this is cool too. And then I start to see business. I'm like, well, there's magic in this old silk hat I found. And I start telling companies, we could do some cool stuff with this. And so my journey, no one paid attention. Oh, he might be onto something. He's kind of weird. And then, this huge tipping point thing happened that I can't exactly explain. But when I got my first book deal, which was I think the deal came like the very end of 2008. We put out the book in 2009. I was at a South by Southwest. I'm sitting at a table with the head of marketing for Wiley, Ellen, and she looks over. She's not at that job anymore. She looks over and goes, "How come you don't have a book?" And I said, "I don't know. Seems like a lot of work." I had been aspiring author since the age of 5. And when they finally stood up and put a book deal in front of me, I was like, eh. And so then I called my friend Julian Smith. I said, hey, you want to write a book? And he said, okay. And we wrote a book and it became a New York Times bestseller. It also became an Inc., a Wall Street Journal, 800 CEO Read, and I forget there's a couple others. All over the place. Like, wow, great job. I have no idea how. Everyone always asks me. I said, I don't know. I just asked. I said, hey, would you guys buy some books? And they said, okay. Like I had nothing slick about it. This is little side note, Josh. I know you're like, what am I doing? Tony Robbins had me in the Internet Money Masters series, and there's like DVD after DVD of like these cutthroat, murderous, I'm an incredible money person, and then goofy Chris Brogan. Years later, I get so many comments and compliments about that. Like, oh, you were very different than the others. I hope I'm super contrasty to some of your people. But my influencer journey, there was no journey. And I say this because I know someone who bought the ticket. It's like, now I'm going to be an influencer. To me, that's a horrendous way to look at the challenge because all I did was go out there and blather about things I was super into and got people really excited about the things I was excited about, showed them every step of the way, all of the secrets. There's another thing that a lot of people do when they're coming up in this world and they're like, I just figured something out. I'm just going to hide it. I have a secret to tell you. No one cares. They still have to execute it. You could share your most intense secrets with people. Nothing's proprietary. Nothing's that interesting. Josh has a show where he's interviewing a whole bunch of people. 1 billion people have done the same thing. What's going to make it work? Because he executed, because he did it well, and he got a lot of good people together. That's how it works. So nothing I know is proprietary. So what did I do? 3 things, really super easy. 1, tried every new toy I could find. 2, talked about the weird stuff I was into. Didn't matter if you were into it or not. We started with Batman. I talked to people all over the globe about Batman. Number 3, I shared all of the cool things I figured out as I figured them out so that everyone else could steal it and compete immediately with me, because it was never competition. It was always just empowering a space to do better. That's my tricks.
Awesome. So good. So you brought up 2 things that are of interest to me. And the first one was bulletin boards. Bulletin boards were, like you said, so inconvenient. And yet, what's the common thread there between bulletin boards and then modern day Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and these connections? What was it that was driving you to use that then? That's the same thing that drives people to connect on social networks today. Is it just that connection, or what is it?
Here's everything about that in a nutshell to me. I think there's such an opportunity to drive conversation around that thing you love the most, and that those tools got so democratized that anyone could use them. The blog, when it came out, not unlike bulletin boards in a different way, but when the blogging technology started coming about, I started blogging before there was that tech. It was such a misery to blog back when I started. But when it came out, I could talk about what I was into, and I didn't have to watch TV to wait for the narrative that was the same as mine. I could create it. I didn't have to read a magazine. You know, I grew up in magazine world. I still buy magazines. I didn't have to find the magazine that matched my interest. I could find the people talking about it because we didn't have to wait for someone to publish it. You know, I look at your boards behind you. Ryan Sheckler sent me an autographed board to this event I was speaking at. He couldn't go, so I met his mom. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. And I brought that home on the airplane ride, and like a million of these skateboarder kids who knew who Sheckler was, I didn't know him, all like accosted me. Like they desperately wanted the board. It had this big giant autograph across it. And I was just like, and part of me wanted to give it away, but part of me was like, well, it was a gift. I really, probably shouldn't do that. But if we wanted to talk boarding, like we don't need anyone's approval. Like we don't have to wait for Thrasher magazine anymore. Right. So to me, that's the biggest shift. That's why bulletin boards, that's why a kid in Maine who wanted to talk about nerdy Star Wars stuff or Star Trek stuff, and who could write fan fiction before even that was that popular, that's what I was doing with this technology. But to me, that's no different than, like I said, these raw coconut oil people. This particular coconut oil that I was sent to talk about, it's raw and super important for people who have crazy allergies and stuff like that. In the old days, you just had to suffer or not have anything. And so I think that that's the cool part, is that we can find such micro opportunities to build really cool businesses.
Awesome. The other thing you mentioned was podcasting. You were involved in podcasting back in the early days. And podcasting, it's kind of interesting how it came, and then it seems like it kind of went, and now it's coming back with a vengeance. Why do you think it's coming back now and blowing up?
So there's a lot of things to that story. So podcasting really started in 2004. I started in 2005. I was a late bloomer in some ways, but I was way ahead of a lot of people. Like you said, it vanished around like 2007 or so. All the mainstream people came in and started using it as sort of like back library. And so it was no longer, that interesting that your friend was a podcaster. And then I would say, to me, what really brought it back another time was Mark Maron and WTF Pod and some of the other shows, Joe Rogan Experience, which is, I hate that show. It's atrocious. Someday I'm going to meet Joe and he's just going to punch me in the mouth. I have said on almost every interview I've ever done when we talk about podcasting how much I hate his show. I don't hate him. I just don't like 3-hour shows of rambling. And so podcasting came back again because of things like Mark Maron. Mark his career was going really bad. He was very depressed, whatever. He starts doing this little interview show out in the garage where he interviews really cool comedians and stuff like that, and asks them insane, heart-rippy, outy questions, and makes for insane content. And then all these other shows came out. Now it's huge. It's mega huge. Mike Tyson has a podcast. Everybody and their brother has a podcast. What brought it back are a few things. One, it became broadband was far more ubiquitous. iTunes and a lot of other platforms made it super much easier to download podcasts onto a smart device. In the way old days, if you wanted to subscribe to podcasts, you essentially had to like eat someone else's brain and use the extra brain power to create a podcast player. And so the ubiquity of all the technology, et cetera. And then I honestly think part of it is just like all the vultures have descended. So there's all these podcast generating networks where, if you give me enough money, I will cut your crappy blather into a show. And I think that there's just endless amounts of that. And so there's so much fat right now in the water, and there's so many boring podcasts. And I'll go and I'll look on places and see just announcement after announcement about how excited someone is to have launched their stupid show. And it looks like everyone else's stupid show. And so I'm really hoping for an implosion at this point. I'm so grumpy about it because it's all people just copying everybody else's stuff. And it's all talking about the same old stuff. And I just think that for this great creative opportunity, this great way to make some good format stuff, man, we got to get off our, get into a better method of what we're doing.
So how do people create unique content that's interesting these days? Because it kind of feels like everything's been done. So how does somebody come up and say, well, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to do something unique. I'm going to create something that's never been created before.
So everything has been done, but that never makes it bad. There's only I think 28,000 words in the English language, and we've used them all, I guess, it turns out, at least once. But I think that what we need to start looking for, first off, we all do this, and it's an important part of our learning journey. We have to copy and steal everything. Erica Napolitano made that up. It's called the CASE method, CASE, copy and steal everything. So if you learn by copying and kind of mimicking and editing, that's how we launch, right? And everyone's first everything. So blog, podcast, newsletter, whatever, it's someone else's basically. You're ripping somebody off. My video blogs, I try to steal from Casey Neistat as much as I can, etc. And there's all these different ways that we do this. And when I was coming up blogging, I mean, so many people emulate what I do. My newsletter goes out, and I said one day, I think I'll put my newsletter out on a Sunday because it's a weird, it's very personable, even though it's business. And in my mind, I think a lot of people about Sunday afternoon get kind of sick of their family and they hide and go look at their email. I thought maybe that's when they'd look at mine. A gazillion newsletters come out on Sunday because it's like Chris Brogan said Sunday is a good day. I could have picked any of the days of the week and said it was a good day, except Monday, because that's a horrible day. So, to me, what we have to do first is get out of the stupid copycat thing. There's so many, you can watch a gazillion YouTubers with fewer than 1,000 subscribers saying, please make sure you like and subscribe. Make sure you push the little notification button so you get a notification every time I drop a new truth bomb. My God, stop it. There's so many other ways to say the things you want to say. I just read an article, Josh, and it was saying that modern music has been destroyed by one digital feature. That's the click. So all digital music has that underlying click tone, click, 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 to make sure the timing is right. And then you put all of your instruments around that. And so everything is so much tighter. But in losing that sort of analog ability to kind of come as close to the beat as you can and try to match as close, and to allow people's voices not to quite work instead of auto-tune and all this sort of a thing, we've compressed and homogenized the experience until it's very tight. And I honestly think some loose and messy has to come back into it. We need the punk rock of podcasting. We need people to jostle microphones and make noise. I think that we need background noise and crap. Everything that you've been told is a bad way to make a podcast, I think that has to come back. And I think that beyond all of the look and feel of all that, we just have to really tighten down to real content that we really care about. My God, there's just endless people talking about stuff they don't really feel like talking about, and it shows in their interviews. It shows in who they bring on. I'm talking to Gary Vaynerchuk because Gary's really great. Gary's wonderful, and he's lovely, and he's a friend. And, Gary can come up with very unique opinions all the time. But if 800 people have Gary as a guest, and we have 800 episodes over the next 4 months of Gary Vaynerchuk, I'm pretty sure we're all going to be pretty set on what we need to know, right? So in my mind, we've got to find the up-and-comers. We've got to find the developing people. Go interview people who just launched their thing and say, hey, what was hard about launching? I mean, to me, that would be way more interesting than finding old schmucks like me. And so I think there's just such a great opportunity to just really blow it open and just leave everybody in the dust. And I think guys like Brian Fanzo, I know he's part of your thing. I think guys like Vincenzo Landino, I think Amy Schmidauer, I think there's this whole new tribe. My fiance, Jacqueline, and with her Get Planty thing, there's all these new voices doing cooler stuff than I ever did. I think that to me that there's just such a new opportunity. Doesn't mean old people, by the way, this is not young and old. Old people, my buddy Charlie Green still makes great stuff. Bob Berg makes amazing stuff. I think there's really great ways to do it as long as we get out of the weird boxes. We don't have to recreate 1980s television. We can do something different, I promise.
Awesome. So going back through your career, what are some moments that were most educational for you? Failure moments, embarrassing moments, but moments that taught you how to do what you do and do it better.
I fail all the time. I think that that's probably my best skill set is, what do I do from that? Adaptability and resilience are more important than pure knowledge. I've done a lot of interviews with people who are Navy SEAL types, other kinds of special operators and special forces types. Eric Greitens wrote a book about resilience. He was a Navy SEAL person. Carrie Lorenz, the first female combat fighter pilot, female fearless leadership, I think is her book. And I would say that adaptability and resilience is the thing I learned the most. So, I mean, real set examples, going to an interview totally bare, had no idea what I was going to ask, and just it was really obvious how bad it was. And so I made the effort to do a lot better research if I was going to do some interviewing. I think that there's a lot of circumstances in my life where I bit off more than I could chew. I keep thinking I'm Richard Branson, and I keep thinking I'm Richard Branson when he had 400 companies, not Branson when he was just ripping off, the British government and trying to make a record store. And I think that a lot of times we look at the after picture and stare at it far too long, and we really need to start at the before picture. And I would say that a lot of my learning came from making a lot of mistakes, launching and then figuring it out after the fact, and apologizing to people, going, I just blew that, man. I don't know. And, giving back some money here and there, and then figuring it out and going, hey, want to give me your money now? And some people will be like, no, I'm totally not going to give you my money. And others going, okay, Brogan. And it all worked great. So there's all that. The other thing I'd say about that, especially as being a pro speaker and all that, the way I got out and started speaking was I went out to a whole bunch of places for free. And then someone offered to pay me. And I was like, okay. And they were like, here's our budget. And I was like, that's how much I charge. How do you know? And I kind of worked my way up. And then I had a New York Times bestseller. So I went, that's how much I charge. And then all these things happened. And now this is how much I charge. And all of these things, you just go and do it. Like there's so many people planning and wanting. And all you do is you do it and F up a bunch. And all you have to do is just not be so sad when you mess up, and you're going to be fine.
So now, at the stage of your career where you've had all these New York Times bestselling books and you've been paid to speak and you've been on all these stages and everything, do you feel a lot of pressure to keep this up, to keep performing, to keep producing? Do you feel like the wolves at your heels, or what's it like?
That's a really good question. So I got a call right after my first book hit the New York Times bestseller from a really wonderful, wonderful gentleman, and Tim Sanders, who wrote Love is the Killer app. And Tim said, Brogan, Sanders, one of the things I got to tell you is that, you're going to have 3 years of insane, can't get enough contact, and everyone in the world is going to want to talk to you. And then it's going to go dark. So you better have another hit by then. I was like, okay. I totally believed him. And then I wrote nothing, no good hits. I wrote lots of books. No one bought nearly as many as I wanted them to. And it's been that way for a while. And so, yes, I feel the wolves at my door, but I look at two things at the same time. I look at some of my friends who are still resting on the laurels of books they wrote decades ago. I'm like, stop it. You've got to have more than one idea. You can't be an author. I mean, unless two things: someone wrote someone's book, which is not what I'm accusing those people I'm thinking about, or you just decided that was good enough. And I just don't believe that. I go to bed with 3,000 ideas in my head. I wake up with 8,000 ideas in my head. Some of them are weird because they came from a dream. And I guess we don't really need sandals made out of cotton candy, but it turns out some of the ideas aren't so bad. And when I'm working on the books I'm working on, I always start my books from a kind of a intersection, which is, what do I know how to do, or what am I willing to learn how to do that might be useful, and who do I want to reach with this book, and how's it going to drive some particular kind of business value to me? And so the next book I'm working on now is, I'm going to talk a lot about sort of disruptors in business, people who have come along and done really interesting things, such that either really small companies or very large companies will have something to glean from it. And that's how I build my projects. I just try to put that intersection together.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So this next part, this is rapid fire, quick answers. What's one of your favorite books
Business
that you look to?
Richard Branson.
All right. Awesome. Who's a favorite influencer that you look up to?
Guy Kawasaki.
Cool. Favorite conference, group, or event?
Oh man, that's like picking one of my favorite kids. I like Mike Stelzner's social media marketing world. I don't like social media marketing. I just like Stelzner and all his people.
Mm-hmm. Preferred social network.
Hmm. Email is my favorite.
See, me too. I use email and it matters to me. I mean, like that's the one thing that I would die without. If I didn't have email, I would legitimately die. And people say, Twitter, Facebook, all this stuff. I'm like, well, that stuff's great, but email is the one thing that I would actually die without.
Email is
By the
about
way,
84% of my revenue. So that's also there.
so going out on a tangent a little bit, because you were an early user of Twitter, what do you think's the future for Twitter? Do you think they're going to pull it out? Do you think what?
You know, I play a game a lot. Like, what if I were the CEO? Like, if someone
Mm-hmm.
knocked it when right before Marissa Mayer got picked for Yahoo, they were saying, "Hey, they're looking for a CEO for Yahoo." Now, the last thing I ever really want is a real life CEO job at some corporation. Like, that would be, I could probably saw myself in half and have more fun. But I thought about it. I was like, "Oh, if I ran Yahoo, what the heck would I do?" And I had awful answers. My answers are terrible. So I don't know what I would do if I had Twitter. Like I think they're going in a million wrong directions, but I don't really have a great handle on the right direction. But as a longtime user, the only thing I can tell you is this. I mean, it's robots talking to robots, but if you don't do it, I can show stat differences on all of my other platforms if I don't drive some amount of content through Twitter every single day. So right now the answer is, stand pat, do something, set up some auto tweets. I don't know, but you got to have something out there or you're doomed.
Yeah, interesting. And what's a favorite tool for you, hardware, software, website, other than email?
Favorite tool, hardware, software. You know what? I'm going to go with my little point and shoot camera that I use for video blogging, which is a Canon G7X Mark II. And I like it. It's small, it's compact, it's easy. I have hardly any buttons I need to use. And I love pocketing it and carrying it around and shooting stuff with it.
Perfect. And what's the best place for people to learn more about you?
Oh, that's an easy one. I guess chrisbrogan.com. That'll work.
Cool. All right. So now for those of you who are listening to this as a podcast format, Chris and I are going to go into a deep dive on how to create non-suicidal content. And if that doesn't sound interesting, I don't know what is. So if you're listening to this as a podcast, head on over to influencesummit.co.co. And Chris and I are going to be talking on video about that. We're going to talk about creating content that doesn't make you want to kill yourself. So stay tuned. Chris, thank you so much for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That wraps things up for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening and join us over at influencerinc.co.